going to go over one of the ways to constrain geometry within Autodesk Fusion 360. When we apply a constraint to a sketch, we are limiting what that individual sketch element can do. And so what a constraint is, it's a restriction or it's a limiting factor on the geometry that we are going to be creating in CAD. And so I'm going to go ahead and create a new sketch. And in that sketch, I'm going to create some lines. And so I'm going to go ahead and start at the origin or the first point, and I'm just going to drag a line up and click to place that line, drag a line over to click and place that line, and drag a line up this way to click and place that line. And when I have those three lines drawn, I'm going to go ahead and hit escape. The length or the size of the lines does not matter at this point. So what the software does is it automatically puts in some constraints as you are sketching to things that it thinks you're trying to do. So for instance, if you look at my sketch here, I have a perpendicular constraint and it's applied between these two lines. And so what perpendicular means is it's always going to form a 90-degree angle. And so that's what that symbol means right there, perpendicular. And so when I move that line, those two lines are always going to stay perpendicular. If I didn't want that to stay perpendicular, I can just click on that constraint and I could delete it. And now notice when I move these lines, I can move that line so these two lines are no longer perpendicular or they do not stay at a 90-degree angle. And so that's an example of a geometric constraint. If I wanted these two lines to always stay perpendicular, I could simply come up here to my constraints and I could click the perpendicular constraint, click on the two lines, and now that perpendicular constraint is applied again. So sometimes when you're sketching, constraints are automatically added to your sketch. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and continue with creating my sketch here. I'm going to go with the line tool again. I'm just going to make a vertical line that comes straight up, a horizontal line that comes straight down. I'm just going to make something like this. Notice that if I hover over this point here, that the software will automatically project out a line so I can line things up easy. So I haven't clicked yet, but it knows where I want the next point to be if I'm trying to make something have symmetry. So I'll go ahead and close that off, and when we close a lines off, we have what's called a shape. All right, and so what we've done is created a shape here in our software, and we know it's a shape because the middle of that, the area of that, has been shaded. I can go ahead and hit escape to end the line command. If I click on one of these lines now and I move it, notice how the sketch still moves. All right, but because of, again, some of these constraints that have been applied, the geometry is limited. Again, so for instance, these two lines will always be perpendicular because of this perpendicular constraint. Again, if I didn't want that perpendicular constraint, I could right click on it and delete it. Oops, let's do that again. I'll click on the constraint and delete it. And now I can select that point and I can make it so those lines are not perpendicular. I also have this perpendicular constraint that's causing those two lines to be perpendicular, which forces these to be perpendicular. So I'll go ahead and right click on that one and delete it as well. And then you can start to see how I have lessened the limitations on my sketch. All right. So the sketch is able to move more. There's more freedom involved. There's less restrictions on it. I see one other constraint right here. This is a vertical constraint. I'm going to go ahead and delete that vertical constraint. So again, I'll click on it and click delete. And what that allows is now that line can move anywhere. It doesn't have to be vertical anymore. All right. And so again, we've eased a restriction on our sketch. If we want to add some restrictions, we can come in here and we can use our constraints. So I can click vertical or horizontal. And when I do that, the line that I select will either become vertical or horizontal. So I'll go ahead and click vertical and horizontal. I'll click and notice how it made my line vertical there. If I click this top line here, it'll make that line horizontal. And so now that this line is horizontal and this line's vertical, those two lines will always stay vertical and horizontal. And so if I right click on that and delete that constraint, those constraints again, you can see that I can move my sketch again. Another way to get that same result would just be to add a perpendicular constraint between those two. And when I add that, it creates that 90-degree angle. I can then select and make that line vertical. And if that line's vertical and these two lines are perpendicular, we're going to have the sketch constrained the way that shows that 90-degree angle. The next geometric constraint we'll look at is the coincident constraint. And so again, I'm just going to get a line and I'm going to click and drag a line over here and hit escape on my screen. So I have a line placed over here. If I click the coincident constraint and I click the top point of that line, and then I click this line on my other geometry I have over here, notice how that line snaps to that geometry. And so what this coincident constraint does is it puts, in this case, that point on the top of the line and this other line together. And so those things will always be together. So if I move this line, notice how it moves the rest of my geometry and those points stay together. All right. If I bring it up, if we extended this line clear up, that point and this line still line up. And so that's the coincident constraint. Next thing I'm going to do with my sketch tools is just drag or click the circle sketch tool over here, and I'm just going to click in and drag a circle. We're going to look at the tangent constraint. And so what the tangent constraint does is it constrains a curve, in this case the curve of our circle, to another curve or a line. And so if I click on the tangent constraint and I click on my circle and I click on the line, notice how if I hit escape that it puts that edge of the circle right on that line. All right, and it will always stay there. No matter how big or small the circle gets, it'll stay tangent to this line. If I click tangent again and make it tangent to this other line that I have here, notice that my geometry repositions and that circle again remains tangent. So that's the tangent constraint. I'm going to go ahead and right click on this circle and delete it just because we're getting a lot of geometry on our sketch here. And I'll right click on this line and delete it as well. The next constraint we're going to look at is the equal constraint. And so if I look at the equal constraint here and I click on that, what the equal constraint do is it's going to make two pieces of geometry equal to each other. So they will always be exactly the same. And so in this case, if I click the equal constraint and I click this kind of angled line on my sketch and click the other angled line, those two lines will become the exact same. And so in this case, they're not positioned the same, but the length and the angle of those lines is the same. And so if I hit escape again and then I start repositioning my geometry, notice that those lines always stay equal to each other. So they're always the same length. All right. No matter what I do, the lines stay the same. And so that's the equal constraint. Next, we'll look at the parallel constraint. And so if I click the parallel constraint and I click again one of these angled lines and click the other one, notice how it makes those two lines parallel to each other. So now those two lines, if we extended them, they would never cross paths. And so that's what the parallel constraint does. It makes those lines parallel to each other. I'm going to go ahead and delete that parallel constraint. So I'll click on it, right click and say delete. And now those two lines do not have to be parallel to each other because I've relieved that constraint. Next, we're going to look at the midpoint constraint. To use this one, I'm going to go ahead and click the drop menu under create, and I'm going to select a point. If I put a point out here in my sketch area somewhere, and I click midpoint, and then I select that point, and then I select this bottom line here, what it's going to do is it's going to put that point that we've selected in the middle of this line. And so it's put it at the midpoint, and that's what that triangle means. So no matter where I move my sketch, that point is always going to stay in the exact middle of that line. The last geometric constraint we're going to look at is the concentric constraint. And so to use this one, I'm going to go ahead and just come over here and make a couple of circles. I'm going to make 3 circles over here. Then I'm going to go ahead and click concentric. And then when I select the circle and I select the second circle, what the concentric constraint does is it makes the midpoint the same on these surfaces. So if we look at our concentric constraint, it constrains 2 or more arcs or circles or ellipses so they have the same center point. And so again, I'll click on that. If I click on the small one and then the big one, it makes the small circle and the larger circle have the same center point. And so again, it doesn't matter what I do to the circles, so I can drag them and make them bigger or smaller, but they will always have the same center point. All right, so that's an overview of the basics of the geometric constraints in sketches in Fusion 360.